If you lived in New York City in the late 1970s, you probably remember the way the city felt waking up. Garbage trucks clanging down narrow streets. The rumble of the subway under your feet. Steam rising from manholes. Parents hustling kids into coats, backpacks half-zipped, coffee cups balanced on countertops. On the morning of May 25, 1979, in a neighborhood called SoHo, it was the first day a 6-year-old boy named Etan Patz was allowed to walk to the school bus stop by himself. It was only 2 blocks. His mom could see the corner from their front door if she leaned out just right. He wore his favorite outfit, a little black Future Flight Captain pilot cap, a white t-shirt, blue corduroys, and blue sneakers. He had $1 in his pocket, money he planned to spend at the corner store on a soda before school. He slung his book bag over his shoulder, told his mom goodbye, and headed out. He never made it to the bus stop. He never made it to school. And that ordinary May morning in New York would end up changing how America thought about missing children forever. Before we get into the investigation, let's slow down for a second and picture the world Etan was walking through. For viewers outside the US or younger folks, SoHo now is art galleries and expensive lofts, trendy shops, and influencer photos. In 1979, it was still in transition, old industrial buildings being converted into live-work spaces for artists and young families. The streets were narrower, grittier. It felt like a mix of warehouse district and village. New York in the late 70s had a reputation. High crime, the aftermath of a fiscal crisis, stories about serial offenders splashed across tabloids. But at the neighborhood level, people still ran their lives with a certain trust. Kids walked to school. They played outside. They ran errands. Stranger abductions were terrifying, but they were also seen as rare. Etan's parents, Stan and Julie Patz, weren't reckless. They were thoughtful people, a photographer dad, a social worker mom, raising their kids in a city they loved. For weeks, Etan had been asking to walk alone to the bus stop. A big kid asked to do a big kid thing. So they practiced. His mom walked the route with him over and over. They talked about crossing streets, about staying on the sidewalk, about going straight to the corner. She watched him handle it. On May 25th, she finally said yes. He left around 8 a.m., down the steps of their Prince Street apartment, into a morning that should have been forgettable in every way. By that afternoon, the city was a different place for the Patz family. When Etan didn't come home from school, his mom called the school first, assuming he'd missed the bus and a staff member kept him. The school said he hadn't been there at all. That's the moment every parent's stomach drops into their shoes. They called the police. They called neighbors. They walked the route themselves again and again, asking shopkeepers and strangers, "Have you seen our son?" Day turned into night. Officers checked the building, canvassed the street, searched the basement. They called Etan's name until their voices went hoarse. He was gone. In 1979, the way law enforcement handled missing kids was very different than today. There was no Amber Alert system. No national database with photos you could blast to every patrol car in the country. No standardized protocol that said full search now, no waiting, no assumptions. In some cases, police would wait, thinking the child might be a runaway or a kid who'd lost track of time and would wander home. In this case, though, it became clear quickly that something was very wrong. Etan wasn't a teenager. He didn't have a history of running off. He'd never even walked to school alone before. Within 24 hours, the NYPD and community volunteers were out in force. Flyers with Etan's face, big brown eyes, mop of sandy blonde hair, were taped to lampposts, deli windows, and subway entrances. Officers knocked on doors up and down Prince Street, Mercer, Worcester. They questioned shop owners, building supers, truck drivers, anyone who might have been in the area. Stan, a professional photographer, had clear, compelling images of his son, no small thing in a pre-camera phone world. Those photos would become iconic. Julie, his mom, sat by the phone, hoping it would ring with good news, fearing what it might ring with instead. Tips started to come in. People reported seeing a small boy they thought might be Etan near the corner store. Some thought they'd seen him talking to a man with shaggy hair. Others thought they'd seen him get into a van. No one's memory lined up neatly enough to give a clear picture. Still, the assumption most parents at the time wanted to cling to was the comforting one. Lost, maybe hurt, but findable. Days passed. Then weeks. The search widened to nearby neighborhoods, boroughs, even other states. Police checked hospitals and morgues. They looked at known sex offenders in the area. They questioned anyone with a van who lived or worked along Etan's route. Nothing solid. No body. No ransom note. No confirmed sighting. It was like he had walked off that stoop and into thin air. The Patz family's life reshaped around a hole. Stan and Julie have spoken about how, in those early months, their apartment became a kind of command center. Maps on the wall. Phone logs. Finished dinners gone cold on the table because a possible tip came in and everything else stopped. Then, slowly, the media took notice in a way they hadn't really done before with missing children. Local stations ran Etan's photo. National outlets started talking about his case. The story wasn't just missing boy. It was the eerie ordinariness of the scene. 2 blocks to the bus stop, sunny morning, no obvious suspect. Etan's face, those wide eyes, that serious little kid expression, connected with people across the country. For a lot of Americans, this was the first time the concept of a stranger abducting a child from a normal urban street felt like it could just reach out and grab their family too. Etan's disappearance wasn't the first of its kind. Other children had gone missing before. Other families were already living that nightmare. But his case hit at a specific moment when the country was beginning to pay attention to those stories in a new way. In the early 1980s, a few companies started printing photos of missing kids on the sides of milk cartons. The idea was simple. At a time when most families had a carton of milk on the breakfast table every day, why not use that real estate to put a face in front of millions of eyes? Etan Patz was one of the very first children featured. There's debate about whether he was the literal first or one of the first, but his image became synonymous with the campaign. If you grew up in the US in the 80s, you might remember that blue and white grid on the carton, the little square photo above the caption. Missing. Have you seen me? For kids, it was unsettling. You'd be eating cereal, staring at the picture of a child roughly your age, and realize that not everyone made it safely to school each morning. For parents, it was a daily, painful reminder that the world might be less safe than they'd been told. Milk carton kids became a phrase in the culture. Behind the scenes, Etan's case was also pushing slow-moving systems to change. Advocates for missing children began pushing for national legislation. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25th, Etan's anniversary, as National Missing Children's Day. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children formed in the mid-1980s, creating centralized ways to share information about missing kids, coordinate between agencies, and provide support to families who once had to navigate this alone. You can draw a line, in part, from Etan's disappearance to things we now take for granted. Missing child posters on highway signs, instant alerts on phones, abducted child protocols drilled into law enforcement agencies around the country. For the Patz family, though, those broader changes didn't solve what mattered most. They still didn't know what had happened to their son. As the 80s moved on, police followed different leads. One of the most persistent names that came up was Jose Ramos, a drifter with a long history of sexually abusing boys. Ramos had dated a woman who sometimes babysat for Etan. He hung around the neighborhood. He was known to lure boys into sewers and tunnels to assault them. He was, to put it bluntly, a predator. When investigators spoke to Ramos in the 80s, he made statements that were chilling but maddeningly vague. He admitted to having taken a boy in a raincoat into a drain near where Etan vanished on the same day he disappeared, but claimed he let the boy go. He insisted the child wasn't Etan. He was later convicted in unrelated sex abuse cases and sent to prison in Pennsylvania. The Patz family was convinced, or at least strongly suspected, that Ramos was responsible for Etan's disappearance. They pursued a civil lawsuit against him in the 1990s. In 2004, in that civil case, a judge found Ramos liable for Etan's death in a wrongful death suit by default, because Ramos refused to participate or respond, not because the court had definitive physical evidence. The Patz family was awarded a symbolic sum, which they never expected to collect. For them, it was less about money and more about having some formal statement that someone had been held responsible, even if only on paper. But civil liability is not the same as a criminal conviction. New York prosecutors never felt they had sufficient evidence to charge Ramos criminally for Etan's disappearance. The case slid back into that strange limbo, officially open, unofficially cold. As years turned into decades, Etan's parents made a heartbreaking decision you don't wish on anyone. In 2001, they had their son officially declared legally dead. Not because they'd given up caring, but because they'd lived more than 20 years in the emotional purgatory of maybe and needed some legal and psychological closure. Stan took the bedroom that had been frozen in time as Etan's and turned it into a workspace. They kept pushing for answers when they could, kept Etan's memory alive, but also tried to live a life that wasn't entirely defined by that single morning in 1979. Then in 2010, more than 30 years after Etan vanished, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office decided to take another hard look at the case. There was a new DA in town, Cyrus Vance Jr. He set up a cold case review, and Etan's file, thousands of pages thick, went back onto active desks. Detectives re-interviewed old witnesses. They went over every name, every rumor, every half-forgotten tip. In 2012, they even did something that drew massive media attention. They started digging up the basement of a building near the Patz home, a place where a handyman had used to work, based on a theory that Etan might have been killed and buried there during construction. TV crews filmed as heavy equipment tore into the floor. Laboratory tests were done on every scrap of soil and debris. They didn't find Etan. For many people, it felt like another false hope. Then, out of nowhere, a new name emerged: Pedro Hernandez. Hernandez had been a teenager in 1979, working at a small bodega on the corner of Prince Street and West Broadway, right along the route Etan would have walked to his bus stop. In 2012, a relative of Hernandez contacted authorities in New Jersey, saying that years earlier, Pedro had confessed to the family that he'd hurt a boy in New York when he was younger. That tip eventually made its way to the NYPD and the Manhattan DA's office. Detectives brought Hernandez in for questioning. He was in his early 50s then, living back in New Jersey, working low-wage jobs, never previously connected to the case. Over several hours of interrogation, recorded on video, Hernandez told a story. He said that on that May morning in 1979, he'd been working in the bodega's basement. He claimed he'd seen Etan on the street, lured him into the basement with the promise of a soda, choked him until he stopped moving, stuffed his body into a plastic bag, and put that bag into a box with some trash. Then, he said, he'd carried it out with the garbage. He didn't say he'd sexually assaulted Etan. He framed it as an accident that had turned into something much worse. He seemed almost detached as he spoke, then grew emotional. In some parts of the taped confession, he was vague and inconsistent. In others, he gave details that seemed eerily specific: the layout of the bodega, how he'd interacted with customers, how Etan had looked. To investigators who'd waited decades, the admission sounded like a breakthrough. They arrested him and charged him with second-degree murder and kidnapping. From there, though, the case got complicated. Very complicated. There were immediate questions. Why had Pedro Hernandez come forward now, after all these years? Was his confession reliable? Could the prosecution prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was telling the truth about events from 33 years earlier? Hernandez's defense team argued that he had a history of serious mental illness, including depression and psychosis. They said he had an IQ in the borderline range, making him especially vulnerable to suggestion. They claimed that he'd told different versions of this story over the years, not just to family, but in church prayer circles, about harming a boy, but never clearly identified as Etan. They painted him as a man who might internalize blame for things he hadn't done, or confabulate under pressure. They also pointed out something crucial. There was no physical evidence linking Hernandez to Etan's disappearance. No body, no forensic traces, no contemporaneous police report tying him to the bodega in a way that proved he was there that morning. And there was that earlier suspect, Jose Ramos. How, the defense asked, could prosecutors now, after years of saying they believed Ramos might be responsible, pivot to a totally different man without DNA or a body? The prosecution countered that false confessions can happen, but that Hernandez's account had details that were hard to explain away. His knowledge of that specific basement, the timing of his job at the bodega, his family's memories of his strange statements years before anyone in law enforcement knew his name. They also argued that Ramos' connections to the case, while deeply suspicious, had never translated into solid evidence. It all boiled down to this: do you believe Pedro Hernandez's confession was genuine, or do you think he'd convinced himself of a story that wasn't true? In 2015, Hernandez went to trial. The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters and curious onlookers, but with people who had followed the case for decades, and of course, with Etan's parents. They were in their 70s by then. They had sat through more false leads than most of us can imagine. They'd seen their son's name turned into a cultural shorthand, a case study, a symbol. Now they were being asked, implicitly, to sit in judgment of a man accused of finally closing that loop. During the trial, jurors saw hours of Hernandez's videotaped confession. They heard from family members who said he'd confessed to them in the past. They heard from mental health experts for both the prosecution and the defense. The defense hammered on Hernandez's suggestibility. They pointed out how often detectives fed him details, how leading some questions were, how the story evolved over the course of the interrogation. They presented expert testimony about how people with certain mental profiles can be more likely to give false confessions, especially when they think it might please authority figures or absolve them in some cosmic sense. The prosecution emphasized those moments on tape where Hernandez seemed to volunteer details unprompted, where his demeanor shifted from confusion to a kind of resigned clarity. They reminded the jury that Hernandez had no obvious motive to falsely confess to this particular crime, after all these years, to police officers he'd never met. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. 9 of the 12 jurors voted to convict. 3 held out, unconvinced that the standard of proof had been met. The judge declared a mistrial. For the Patz family, it was another kind of limbo, this time in a courtroom, so close to a legal resolution, yet still legally unresolved. The Manhattan DA made a decision that surprised some and relieved others. They decided to try Hernandez again. In 2017, he went back on trial. This time, prosecutors refined their case, tightening their presentation of the confession, sharpening their arguments about why Hernandez's statements should be seen as reliable. They again called Etan's parents to testify about that day and the decades of aftermath. The defense doubled down on their portrayal of Hernandez as mentally ill and easily led. They brought in additional expert testimony, pointed again to Ramos, and highlighted every inconsistency they could find in the confession. New York and much of the country watched a very particular drama play out. On one side, a desperate desire, by the family, by the public, by the system, to finally have an answer. On the other, the ethical demand that no one be imprisoned for life on anything less than proof beyond a reasonable doubt, especially in a case with no physical evidence and a vulnerable defendant. This time, after 9 days of deliberation, the jury came back with a different decision. They found Pedro Hernandez guilty of kidnapping and felony murder in the death of Etan Patz. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison. When the verdict was read, Julie and Stan Patz wept. Outside the courthouse, they said they finally had some measure of justice for their son. The defense vowed to appeal, and in the years since, legal debates have continued about the strength of the case. Appeals courts in New York have upheld the conviction so far, agreeing that the jury had enough evidence to reasonably find Hernandez guilty. Experts on false confessions and wrongful convictions remain divided. Some see Hernandez's confession as fitting a pattern seen in other cases where innocent people, especially those with mental vulnerabilities, came to believe they committed crimes they didn't. They worry that the pressure to solve such a famous case might have skewed how investigators and jurors interpreted the evidence. Others see his statements as credible, and note that false confessions in stranger abduction homicide cases are relatively rare compared to the data set we have of known true confessions. For most of us on the outside, especially if we're not lawyers, it's tempting to want clear, comforting answers. In reality, Etan's case leaves us in a complicated place. On the one hand, there is a man serving a long sentence based largely on his own words about a crime committed decades earlier. On the other hand, you have parents who spent 38 years not knowing what happened to their 6-year-old, who now feel that the system has finally recognized someone as the person responsible. You also have a larger story that stretches beyond the guilt or innocence of one man. The disappearance of Etan Patz changed the way America thinks about missing children at a deep level. Before Etan, missing kids were often treated as family issues, local mysteries, stories that might get a small write-up in a local paper and then fade. After Etan, there was a growing recognition that children can be targets of serious crimes even in seemingly safe environments. Fast, coordinated responses matter. Sharing information across jurisdictions can make the difference between finding a child and never knowing. Milk carton campaigns, National Missing Children's Day, the formation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, new laws like the Missing Children's Assistance Act. They didn't appear out of nowhere. They were pushed by families like the Patzes, by advocates who used cases like Etan's and Adam Walsh's to argue that the system had to change. Today, if a young child fails to show up at school and is reported missing, the response looks very different than it did in 1979. Amber alerts can go out within hours. Photos can be shared on social media and to officers' phones instantly. Databases allow agencies in different states to see the same information in real time. Those systems are not perfect. Children still go missing. Some cases still don't get the attention they deserve. Bias about whose children are seen as cute victims worth front-page coverage still exists. But there is a recognized framework now that simply didn't exist when Etan walked out his front door that May morning. For many people, especially in New York, Etan's legacy is twofold. He's the boy whose face taught a generation that missing children weren't just runaways or family disputes. They were kids who could vanish on the way to a bus stop. Kids who needed the whole community to care. He's also the boy whose absence reshaped laws, media practices, and parental instincts. If you're a parent now who hesitates the first time your child asks to walk to school alone, if you find yourself watching them a little longer from the window as they round the corner, you're living, in some small way, in the shadow of what happened to Etan. There is, of course, a tension there. We know that statistically, stranger abductions are rare. The vast majority of crimes against children are committed by people they know, family, acquaintances, people in their circle. We also know that giving kids appropriate freedom is healthy. But we are also creatures of stories. And the story of a 6-year-old boy in a pilot's cap who disappeared between his front door and the school bus stop is one that lodges deep in the collective imagination. So where does that leave us when we try to talk about a case like this? We can acknowledge the legal ambiguity, the debates about Hernandez's confession and Ramos's shadow. We can talk about the shortcomings of 1970s police work and the ways interrogation tactics have evolved. We can wrestle honestly with the ethics of convicting someone with no DNA, no body, no eyewitness. We can also hold space for the sheer human loss. For a boy who liked drawing and telling stories, who wanted to be independent. For a mom who watched him walk down the street that morning, trusting the world enough to let him go that far on his own. For a dad who spent decades channeling his grief into advocacy, while his son's photo became synonymous with a whole movement. When you strip away the media, the legal wrangling, the policy changes, you're left with something very simple and very hard. A child never came home. For all the words we use, landmark case, watershed moment, cultural shift, that's the core. As you think about Etan Patz, maybe the most respectful thing we can do is let him be more than just the first boy on the milk carton. Remember that he was a real kid, with a specific laugh and specific worries and joys, living in a city that could be magical and dangerous at the same time. Remember that behind every missing child poster, every Amber Alert, every milk carton photo, there is a family whose world has been split into before and after. And remember that the systems we build in response to cases like Etan's, databases, alerts, protocols, aren't just bureaucratic boxes to check. They're attempts, imperfect as they are, to make sure that when a child doesn't show up where they're supposed to be, we don't shrug and say they'll probably turn up. We search. We mobilize. We care. We learned that, in part, because in 1979 a 6-year-old boy in SoHo didn't make it to the bus stop, and his parents refused to let the world forget his name.